Hello and welcome. How easily can humans adapt to living in space for long periods of time? The industry of space travel is still very young, and scientists are having to collect as much information as possible on what happens to the body and the mind while in orbit and beyond. But there's not only the physical strain of zero gravity, but also the mental stress of being crammed into such a small space with no privacy or outside contact, and of course the unpredictability of space. Last month, I had the privilege of conducting Al Jazeera's first interview in space with the astronauts aboard the International Space Station, the ISS. They shared the fascinating world of zero gravity as well as the challenges of day-to-day activities. On this week, Colonel Douglas Wheelock and Tracy Caldwell-Dyson will embark on the challenge of commanding an emergency spacewalk mission to repair faulty equipment on the ISS. During our conversation, Colonel Wheelock explained some of the difficulties involved in such tasks.
You spend a few days learning that everything floats in space, and so Velcro becomes your best friend as you lay things out for your daily experiments and things. And so the timeline is actually pretty aggressive, and it gets better and better each day. But these first couple of weeks, for me anyway, I found myself kind of pressing up and using up all the margin in my timeline as I try to get my tasks done, and they tend to spill into each other.
The astronauts aboard the ISS, and today we ask, what are the challenges of life in space? Remember, you can join our conversation with your questions and comments. You can send an SMS or an email. Today I'm joined by author Mary Roach, who spent years researching the challenges of space and planning of missions to Mars. She discusses in her latest book, Packing for Mars, The Curious Science of Life in the Void, where she explores the complexities of the human mind and body in zero gravity. Her research took her around the world, where she visited simulated space stations and heard first-hand accounts of life in orbit. Mary, great to have you here.
Great to be on.
Let me ask you, what was the most startling thing you learned about life in space?
What was amazing to me was just the extent to which zero gravity changes everything. The entire human body. You name a body part, there's something weird that's going on in zero gravity.
And then what about the myths? Because a lot of people have an idea of what life is supposed to be like in space. What are the myths and what's the reality?
Well, the one thing that really surprised me was that you assume that, say, a trip to the moon is going to be constant excitement. You couldn't get any more exciting than going to the moon. But boredom was actually an issue. There's this wonderful quote, Gene Cernan, the astronaut on Apollo 17. He's on the way to the moon. He says, "Funny thing happened on the way to the moon, not much. Should have brought some crossword puzzles." You know.
Now, at what point did scientists, from what you can tell, start focusing on the mental side of the preparation? That is, preparing astronauts for the issues of long periods of time and the adjustments they'd have to make.
Well, they were focused from the very beginning. There was a fear that they would be possessed by this breakaway effect, that when they went into space, they'd be overcome with this kind of euphoria and want to just fly onward into the void. But now it's all shifted toward getting along in a small space. You got 6 people in a very small space, very frustrating environment. You've got no way, you can't just go slam the door and go out for a drive. So the frustration kind of turns to anger, and if you turn that inward, as they sometimes do because they don't want to alienate their crew members, then you can have depression. So that's a concern too. Also, there's also worry that they won't be forthcoming with the psychologists and psychiatrists because they worry, well, maybe I won't get another mission. So they tend to suppress it, and that's been an issue.
Did you find that the stories you heard from people who'd been up there, I mean, that really these issues such as anger did become a major problem? Depression
was a problem. I spoke with a few cosmonauts when I was in Russia. And one of them told this story. He was on Mir for 6 months as Alexander Levake, and he said this amazing thing. He said, yes, it was depressing. There were times when I wanted to hang myself, but of course in zero gravity, you can't do that.
That's kind of Russian humor, I guess.
Yeah, a little Russian humor, yeah.
Now, what sort of preparation nowadays do you find the astronauts go through for these kind of more extended missions?
Well, they're doing extensive training, simulations, everything that they're going to do in space. They will have done in a simulation on the ground. I'll give you an example. On the ISS, if you're going on a spacewalk and you're out and you're in the void floating in your big white sort of marshmallow suit, you have rehearsed that in a giant swimming pool over and over again. Because floating in water is a similar environment to floating in space, so they will do all these chores. And for a 6-hour spacewalk, 250 hours of training in the tank, so they know really what they're doing. They don't want any risks when you're in space.
Did you get to try on all these trips? Did you get to try any zero gravity and experience it? Yeah, how was
that?
I
went. It was so exciting. I'm such a geek. I was on
it's good to try.
I was on the. It's a weightless flight simulator. It's this plane out of Ellington Field in Texas, and it does this pattern like this. And as the plane goes over and down, you have about 22 seconds of weightlessness.
Yeah.
And it's just, you weigh nothing. It's an extraordinary feeling.
Now I'm going to get a question to you that came in from Kenya, from one of our viewers there, Janet, who wrote in saying, how does one feel out there in space, emotionally speaking?
I think, well, it depends a lot on the length of the mission. For a short mission, what I've heard, that they keep them so busy that you don't have a lot of time to dwell on your emotional state. You're so busy. I think if there is a negative side, it's that you are very stressed and sleep deprived. It's hard to, because they've got a very strict schedule. They've got the pre-sleep phase. They say the astronauts will be sleeping at 11:58 p.m. Well, who sleeps like that? So that, but they speak also about the view, seeing Earth from space is a profoundly affecting thing, just sort of a spiritual experience for many astronauts. I sadly have not experienced it myself.
Now, of course, you and I were talking just before the camera started rolling about, the curiosity people have about space, and
Yes.
there's so many questions the public
Yes.
have. And we actually went out into DC and asked a few people to pose questions for you regarding, what your research
Great.
based on what you saw, and interesting topics came up. Of course, one of them was sex.
Yes.
So let's listen to this.
I would like to know, how will you have sex in space?
Okay. Did they answer any of those sort of questions?
Well, I have a chapter about mating in zero gravity, and I didn't ask, because no astronaut has come forth and said, yes, I've done it. There's a couple in the Soviet Union, in Russia, that's people have had rumors about, and one couple here, but nobody's on the record. So what I did is I talked to marine biologists who study animals that mate while floating in water, which, as we know, is similar to floating in space. And the answer is gravity is your friend when it comes to sexual intercourse. It's a little difficult to stay together. And I asked an astronaut about this. I said, I heard that it might be a little difficult, and he said, it's nothing that a roll of duct tape would do.
Well, but of course NASA banned it, didn't they? I think recently
They don't want. They get really
tired
tired of people asking that question
okay.
over, and they want them to focus on the science and the importance of the mission.
Eventually it will be important. I mean, for colonizing.
Well,
So it's like,
yes, absolutely. And if you're going to talk about, the consequences of sex, fertility, conception,
Right.
we don't really know the answers to those questions. And if the goal is to colonize space, we better
you
look
better get this
into
eventually.
it. Yes.
So now, okay, another question from a viewer here. This
Yeah.
came from one of the people we spoke to in the street again. This time, simple task of getting to the bathroom.
Yes.
How do you use the bathroom in space?
How do you,
What happens to the human waste after it stays for a day or so? Does it get discarded? How?
so human waste and
Yes, absolutely. I have the definitive chapter on that in my book. Here again, the toilet depends on gravity. This is a little graphic, but since they asked, okay. Gravity is what causes separation, as the waste management people say. That's what brings the material down away from the body and into the toilet. You don't have that in zero gravity, so they have to make toilets where air flows. It's kind of like a shop vac.
Suction.
Airflow sort of pulls the material away. So that's how it works. But the toilet has to be tested. That's a tricky thing. Zero gravity, they put it on that airplane. Some poor guy has 22 seconds. Good luck.
Toilets in space. How has the selection procedure for astronauts changed? I mean, over the years,
Yes.
from what you could tell, have the criteria changed?
Yes, very much so. In the early days, of course, you had the right stuff. Aggressiveness, macho, virility, bravado, because you were one man going where no one had gone, and that was a tremendously frightening thing. You needed to be brave, and you were taking on a lot of risk. And now it's much longer missions, more people, confined space. So now you want people who play well with others. You want people who, some of the the recommended attributes that I came across in the NASA publications, ability to relate well to others with sensitivity and empathy, fairness, sense of humor. So it's not this sort
of
of
the advert for an astronaut now, is it?
Yeah, it's kind of like Richard Gere and Knights and Rodanthe.
Now, the old sort of notion of astronauts having to be tremendously fit and physically like really durable.
Yes.
Has that gone?
There's less. I don't know that it's not gone. And exercise is incredibly important in space, because as soon as you are weightless and you're not putting weight on your skeleton, you're not using your bones or your muscles, your body starts to dismantle them, and that's very dangerous. So exercise is a huge component of space. They're very fit. They're doing 2 hours exercise a day.
And of course, more countries are going into space, and so those countries are choosing their astronauts and cosmonauts depending on the labeling. Now, I gather Japan has quite a tough and maybe a rather eccentric selection procedure.
Yeah, I spent time. They were choosing. There were 2 openings for the Japanese astronaut corps, and the 10 finalists were in this isolation chamber, and they were being watched by psychiatrists, psychologists. And one of the tests is the day that I got there, they're handing out these envelopes, and I said, well, what are they doing? And they pull out these sheafs of color paper, and I said, this is a test? Yes, it's paper craft. I said, you mean it's origami? It was. They had to. The astronaut candidates, the applicants would make 100 cranes, and they'd be strung together. And then the psychiatrists would compare the early cranes to the later cranes, and was their accuracy consistent over time? And in fact, even though it sounds kind of goofy, it was actually an appropriate test, because you can't be a slack. If you're an astronaut, you've got to be attention to detail. You got to stay focused. So it was an interesting.
Although I would hate to see repairs on a Japanese space station. Where's my paper?
Exactly. This is made of paper.
We're going to take a very short break here, Mary. I've got more questions for you on this fascinating topic. When we return, how close are we to experiencing life on Mars? And what are the biggest challenges facing that mission? As we take this break, here are a few questions that people on the streets of Washington, D.C. offered to our camera team.
How do you sleep without floating up in the air?
How do you bake food in space?
So how do plants grow? Do they grow up? Do they grow sideways? Do they grow down?
Welcome back. We're discussing life in space and the challenges the human body endures in zero gravity. I'm joined by popular writer Mary Roach, whose latest book, Packing for Mars, The Curious Science of Life in the Void, involved years of research looking into those challenges. Now, we had those questions just before the break. A bunch of people we talked to on the streets of DC, and they had issues like, how do you bake in space? How do you sleep? Do plants grow up, down? Which way? Did you discover any of these answers?
Yeah, sleeping, it's interesting. When you sleep in zero gravity, it's very, very comfortable. One of the things on Earth that wakes you up is you've been on one position and your body kind of wants you to roll over. So none of that. You could sleep like a baby. However, it's very psychologically disconcerting to not, for some astronauts, not have a pillow to press against. And some of them described sort of cramming themselves into a corner to feel like they're lying down. Rather than, I mean, it's like going back into the womb on some level. You'd think it would be something really comfortable, but
they don't have allocated a bunk even they can strap into.
They have bags. It's sort of like a bivouac.
In terms of, food, obviously they have processed food, but no one's so far tried to bake in space, as far as I can tell, have they?
No, they have it sort of looks like a briefcase that you stick it's a meal in a pouch and you heat it up, and it's come a long way. Space food used to be those little compact cubes that you pop in your mouth because they didn't want any crumbs, and you had to rehydrate it inside your mouth. It was very distasteful. They tended to fly into space and then come back down, those foods.
Now, of course, some of the experiments they're conducting include looking at plants and other life forms in space, how they respond. And one of the questions we were asked was, well, which way do plants grow?
Yep. Well, they respond to gravity and to light, so it may depend on the plant. And I know that they've done studies. I remember hearing a wonderful story about early days of space. Onion bulbs had been sent up on in the Soviet Union, and the cosmonauts saw the onion bulbs. They had some bread, and they ate the experiment.
Oh no! Now, of course, this idea of going to Mars, which is what we want to focus on this part of the show. It's a much longer journey. It's not a case of just going into orbit and the space station or even the moon.
Right.
It's talking 500+ days in space, isn't it?
That's correct.
That's going to, from the investigations you've done, that's going to be really tough on humans, isn't it?
Yes, it is. When you're in space that long, you have bone loss and muscle atrophy to the extent where it's like being in a wheelchair. You end up losing up to one statistic I heard is up to 50% of your bone density would disappear when you've been in space that long, and that's dangerous. If you had to deal with an emergency when you came back down, you might break a bone. Also, the radiation, because once you leave the Earth's protective environment, you've got cosmic radiation, which you don't have to deal with here on Earth, and you've got, if there's a solar event, that's a big spike in radiation. So you'd have to shield the capsule, but that makes it very heavy. So you think, what do you do? Well, one idea is to take the food, because food is hydrocarbons, which is a good radiation shield, and so you would line your capsule with your food on the way there.
And on the way back?
And on the way
waste.
back, sadly, you would use the waste material.
Okay,
to
there's
make
an
all
answer to our
shingles.
viewers asking, where does the waste go? Well,
Yes, that's right.
The issue I gather is also that the astronauts then going on that kind of journey would have to have a different physical disposition. I gather that certain race types actually may be better suited for it.
Well, what was interesting is there would be sort of a return to the original sort of right stuff of the Mercury era, the Mercury space era, where you need somebody very autonomous, a self-starter, because there's a 20-minute communications lag. So if there's an emergency, you can't call and go, what do we do? Because you've got 20 minutes before they hear, what do we do? So you've got to figure it out on your own. So you've got to be a real self-starter, very aggressive, but still getting along with other people. So it's tricky. You've got to be both at once. So it wouldn't be me.
You know, it's interesting because, of course, a lot of the movies that have been made over the years, I mean, literally from the 70s, Silent Running, Solaris, recently The Moon.
THX 1138.
Well, and all these, it's basically show people in space going crazy.
Yeah.
What do you make of those movies?
Yes, well, I think, well, there's been enough examples of long-duration space, people on missions really having a tough time of it. Because it's, you think about it, everything that we love as human beings, plants, color, the wind on your skin, babies, just everything is gone. You don't have all of these things that you kind of take for granted on Earth, and you really miss those things tremendously.
Well, as we pack for Mars, are they preparing the astronauts to deal with this kind of stuff? Is it really a major part of the training?
No, well, for now, Mars is so far off that I think that they're not. They're focused more on how would we get back from Mars and like the technical issues still.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, just the sheer amount of time out there in space, they're exposed to more risk of things going wrong. We know recently, for example, the ISS has had a failure with its cooling system.
Yes.
That's just on the edges of the Earth, the International Space Station. What about when you're going out to Mars, the risks, mechanical risks? Has NASA talked about that kind of stuff?
Yeah, well, they fly spare parts for everything. But again, with the Mars mission, that becomes very, very heavy. And then you can only blast off so much because you're going a long way, and you really have to cut down on the weight. So you've got to be sort of jack of all trades. So you would want somebody who's not just got one area of expertise, but who can fix the toilet or fix the the food reheater or the cooling. The training, I would imagine, is going to be a tremendous, protracted amount of time. Also, you want to have the crew training together, getting used to each other. So if there's any psychological, emotional problems, they'd work that out on the ground before they're, a lot of the talk, I mean, amongst us terrestrial humans is basically what happened. We forgot the moon. We went there, half a century ago, and we've left it alone now. And now the president of the US is not even interested in the moon anymore. Is there any sense among the people you spoke to of loss? That the moon is now being bypassed. Yes, among people who work at NASA, people who are know a lot about the geology, planetary geologists. Their feeling is we went there. It was from Apollo 11 to Apollo 17. There weren't that many missions, and we went to sites that were easy to land on, not necessarily the most interesting geologically. So there's so much more they would love to do there. They don't feel like we're done by any means. Yeah.
And of course, the issue of the issue of the distance going to Mars, presumably the resources now they're going to have to allocate for that kind of distance is going to be pretty tricky, isn't it?
Yes, and just the tremendous expense. I would love a Mars mission. I'd love to see it happen in my lifetime. But I think it'd be great if it were a cooperative effort, like the International Space Station. That's been a 10-year exercise in global space cooperation, and really kind of a success in that way. And I think if we could all pull together, not just expertise but financially, everybody would get behind. I mean, it would be a very exciting thing for the planet, for the species.
I've got to get an email to you, though. There are the skeptics, and this one came from Khalid Ali Khan in Pakistan, who wrote in saying, the billions of dollars invested to send humans to space are a waste. And it's true, those who argue, that the planet here has so much to fix already. Why are we spending so much on launching out over in that direction? Shouldn't we be spending the money down here first?
Well, that's why I'd love to see it to be a global effort where everyone pitches in. But I wouldn't say that it's a waste. If you look at the things the technology that's come out of the space effort, everything from like high-speed wireless data transfer to automated insulin pumps. I mean, anything that's miniaturized, automated, lightweight, very strong, fireproof, all of that stuff, NASA's often had a hand in it. So there really is a lot of positive, other than just putting people in space, a lot of positive things.
So that research really has helped across the board, And, we talked a little bit about how, at the beginning, how profound it is for people, astronauts, to look out and see the Earth. Generally, what sense did you get of how their life had been changed from that experience of going into space? Was there a common change you noticed among the various people you spoke with?
It really ran the gamut. There's so many astronauts today that are really so focused on the just the day-to-day tasks and everything that they have to get done. But others, I mean, I spoke to this astronaut who said, Sandy Magnus, I think it was, who said, I could see, looking down at the Earth, I could see our atmosphere, and it was this thin, little, fragile layer, and I thought, uh-oh, we'd better take care of that. You know, just this sense of the fragility of the planet. The planet is this almost this character, where you're walking around on it, you don't really see it. And you see it, it's like out there in the middle of nowhere on its own, and very inspiring for many of them.
Well, I interviewed Buzz Aldrin a while back, and he had a lot of problems when he came back to Earth. I mean, there was a sense of depression. Well, it was depression, but there was a sense of anticlimax. What do I do next?
Right. I could. Yes. Yeah. When you've been to space, you know what compares with that. I think it's coming back from combat in a way. Just it's such an extreme thing, and then you come back, and here's your shopping list, and you've got to do your laundry, and you think, but wait a minute, I was in space last week.
Is there any counselling? Do they really? I mean, do they
Yes.
have in mind presumably what happens to people when they come down to this?
Yes, they do have counseling. I don't know. I don't know how adequate it is, but certainly they have it available. I think again, there's a concern like if you make use of it, will they then maybe not send you up again? So maybe hesitation to take advantage of it.
You of course had the advantage of seeing, you know, space programs in different countries. I mean,
Yeah.
you look at the different cultures.
Yes.
Do you get a sense that we are all on the same track, or is it going to be quite a mess when all these different cultures get up there, especially if they all have to live together?
I think because of the long training period, with a mission to Mars, you'd be training for probably years, so you get to know the person. I asked a Japanese, the flight surgeon in Japan, I said, so the Japanese culture and the American culture, very, very different. You know, Americans very sort of aggressive and macho, the Japanese more deferential, and he said, well, but what happens after 6 months, the Japanese astronauts become more American. So they get a little more aggressive, and everybody finds sort of a common ground to stand on. So I think it's kind of it's a sort of wonderful global cooperation.
Well, if you're going to have to put waste matter on the way back from Mars, you're going to have to be friends.
You're going to definitely have to be
waste matter
friends,
on the
yes.
walls. Mary Roach,
Yeah.
thank you very much. Fascinating conversation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for being with us. Remember, you can follow the show on Facebook and see what we're up to today. You can give us your feedback on the program and post your questions and comments. On the next show, Rwandans go to the polls, but how free and fair will those elections be? Critics charge that President Paul Kagame, a favorite of the US government, has turned into a dictator, crushing all dissent. Be sure to tune in for that. From me and the team, we'll see you next time.